You open your investment app expecting the usual slow grind. Maybe a few $100s up, maybe a small dip. But instead you notice something that feels different. The numbers have moved in a way that feels meaningful, not dramatic, not life-changing overnight, but noticeable. The kind of movement that makes you pause. You realize that the portfolio did not just grow because you deposited money. It moved because it exists. It reacted to the market. It fluctuated. It produced. And for the first time, you feel something shift internally. Not excitement, not hype. Something calmer than that. Control. It is not the rush of a winning trade. It is not the thrill of gambling and getting lucky. It is the quiet recognition that a system is beginning to function without constant supervision. You start to sense that the machine is turning on its own. That feeling is subtle, but it is powerful. It changes the way you look at your future. Most people believe wealth changes at 100,000 or 1 million. They imagine that is the point where stress disappears and options expand. But the real structural shift often happens much earlier. Around $50,000 invested, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. Growth starts competing with you. Allocation decisions start to matter. Volatility feels survivable. And your identity begins to change from someone who saves into someone who allocates capital. $50,000 is not about status. It is about structural maturity. This is what really happens after $50,000 invested. When your portfolio reaches $50,000, the math begins to feel different. At an average long-term return of 8%, $50,000 produces roughly $4,000 per year. That is about $330 per month on average. Some months more, some months less. But the key detail is this: that number starts to matter. $300 is no longer symbolic. It can cover utilities. It can absorb minor setbacks. It can shorten timelines. It can reduce psychological pressure. And because it appears without additional labor, it shifts your perception of effort itself. If you are investing $1,000 per month, there will be months when the market contributes nearly a third of that amount for you. There will even be occasional months where the market contributes more than your deposit. That is the crossover. Until this stage, your contributions clearly dominate your growth. You feel like you are carrying the weight. But at $50,000, the weight begins to distribute. You are no longer the only engine moving the portfolio forward. The portfolio itself becomes an engine. And that changes how you think. When returns begin to rival deposits, you stop obsessing over squeezing an extra $100 out of your budget. You stop micromanaging minor spending categories. You begin focusing on protecting and optimizing the system instead. It is no longer about hustle alone. It is about efficiency. It is about durability. Patience becomes easier because you can see the machine working. Even if progress is not explosive, it is consistent enough to feel tangible. Compounding stops being a chapter in a finance book. It becomes visible inside your own account. And once growth starts competing with you, you begin to respect compounding differently. It is no longer theory, it is structure. Below $20,000, asset allocation barely changes outcomes in a noticeable way. Whether you are 80% equities or 70% equities makes little difference on a small base. But at $50,000, percentages begin to carry weight. A 2% difference in long-term return compounded over 20 years can mean tens of thousands of dollars in difference. That is not abstract anymore. That is a used car, a year of living expenses, a meaningful financial cushion. This is where thinking matures. You stop asking only how much you can contribute. You start asking how intelligently your capital is structured. Are your fees too high? Is your portfolio overly concentrated? Are you unintentionally taking risks you do not understand? Do you need broader diversification? Are you optimizing for taxes over decades, not just this year? These are investor questions, not saver questions. At this stage, allocation discipline can outperform extreme frugality. You could cut $500 of lifestyle spending and feel productive. But adjusting long-term portfolio structure might produce more benefit without sacrificing quality of life. That realization marks a shift from effort-based thinking to leverage-based thinking. $50,000 forces you to take your capital seriously because now small inefficiencies scale, small mistakes scale, but small improvements scale as well. Precision begins to outperform intensity. One of the most overlooked changes at $50,000 is how volatility feels. A 10% drop at this level is $5,000. On paper, that looks scarier than a $500 drop at $5,000 invested. The numbers are larger, The movement is visible. The stakes feel heavier. But emotionally, something different often happens. You have already seen growth. You have watched your portfolio move up and down. You have experienced months where growth occurred without direct effort. That history gives you context. Instead of panic, you feel calculation. Instead of urgency, you feel evaluation. Instead of fear, you feel curiosity. You begin to understand that markets expand and contract. They accelerate and consolidate. They move in cycles, not straight lines. And now that your portfolio is large enough to feel those movements meaningfully, you begin learning how to live inside them without reacting impulsively. That is a profound shift, because the difference between long-term investors and short-term participants is not intelligence, it is stability. $50,000 forces you to confront whether you can remain stable when numbers fluctuate meaningfully. That stability becomes a skill, and like any skill, it improves with exposure. There is another change that begins to happen at $50,000 that most people never articulate. Time itself starts to feel different. When you are building from zero, every month feels heavy. Every contribution feels visible. Every sacrifice feels recorded in your memory. Progress feels manual. But once you reach 50,000, you start noticing that some months pass without dramatic effort, and yet the portfolio still advances. Growth begins to occur in layers. There is your effort. There is market return. There is reinvested return. These layers stack quietly. And because they stack quietly, you begin to understand something deeper about wealth. Wealth is less about dramatic moves and more about sustained alignment. When behavior aligns with time and scale, progress compounds almost invisibly. You are no longer trading time directly for growth in a linear way. Growth becomes layered, and layered growth feels different from earned growth. At some point after $50,000 invested, you will experience something unusual. A year where your portfolio grows more than you personally contributed. Maybe you invested $12,000 that year and the market added $15,000. Or maybe you invested $10,000 and it added $8,000. Either way, the scale surprises you. You realize that the slope is bending, not because you changed your behavior dramatically, but because scale has begun cooperating with time. Compounding requires mass. $50,000 begins to provide that mass. When this happens, work starts to feel different. You no longer feel solely responsible for financial progress. You begin to feel supported by the system you built. That support creates calm, and calm improves decision-making. This is where gravity starts to appear. Not full financial independence, not passive income replacing salary, but visible assistance from capital. And once assistance becomes visible, belief strengthens. Below $50,000 you are building. After $50,000 you are managing. That is a subtle but important difference. When you are building, most of your attention is directed toward accumulation. You measure progress by how much you can add. You focus on saving rate. You track deposits. You celebrate milestones and round numbers. But once you cross 50,000 invested, accumulation becomes only one part of the equation. Management becomes equally important. You begin to see yourself as someone who owns capital rather than someone chasing savings goals. Ownership changes posture. Ownership changes responsibility. Your questions begin to evolve. You think in decades instead of months. You consider long-term tax strategy rather than short-term optimization. You evaluate diversification across asset classes. You think about risk-adjusted return. You begin to understand sequence of returns risk and how timing affects compounding over long horizons. These are not the questions of someone scrambling to build a cushion. These are the questions of someone shaping a trajectory. And internally, something softens. You check your account less frequently. When you do check, you do not feel the same tightness in your chest. You understand that fluctuations are part of growth. You have lived through small downturns and recovered from them. You have watched the line rise over time. Despite temporary dips, that identity shift reduces stress beyond finances. When you feel less financially fragile, you feel more emotionally stable. You negotiate work situations differently. You evaluate opportunities differently. You tolerate uncertainty differently. Because you know you have a base. $50,000 is not wealth in the traditional sense. It does not buy mansions. It does not generate full financial independence. But it creates stability of identity. And identity compounds just like money. There is also a deeper awareness that begins forming at this level. Opportunity cost becomes tangible. Below $50,000, opportunity cost feels theoretical. You understand intellectually that spending $5,000 today could have grown over time, but the base is small enough that the emotional weight of that decision is limited. At $50,000, opportunity cost becomes visible. If you withdraw capital or redirect it, you can see how it would have compounded over years. You begin calculating trade-offs automatically, not in a restrictive way, but in an informed way. You stop asking, "Can I afford this right now?" You start asking, "What does this choice do to my trajectory over 15 or 20 years?" That is maturity. That long-term lens protects you from short-term emotional swings. It also protects you from lifestyle creep disguised as progress, because at this stage, your money begins representing optionality, career flexibility, geographic freedom, the ability to wait rather than rush. When money represents options instead of consumption, discipline becomes easier. You are not denying yourself pleasure. You are preserving flexibility. There is another layer that rarely gets discussed. At $50,000, conversations about money begin to feel different internally. You may not talk about it publicly, you may not display it, but privately you feel less intimidated by financial topics. Investment strategy no longer feels abstract. Economic news feels less threatening. Market downturns feel less catastrophic. Because you have skin in the game. And because you have survived movement, you begin to trust your framework. That trust reduces noise. You stop chasing headlines. You stop reacting to daily narratives. You understand that your portfolio is designed for decades, not days. That psychological quietness is powerful. It frees mental energy. And mental energy is often more valuable than capital itself. When you are not constantly reacting, you can think clearly. You can plan deliberately. You can live without the constant hum of financial anxiety in the background. That quiet confidence is one of the most underrated benefits of crossing 50,000 invested. There is also a compounding effect happening beneath the surface that many people miss. As your portfolio grows, your income often grows as well. Career progression tends to align with age and experience. Promotions happen, skills compound, opportunities expand. When income growth combines with an existing $50,000 base, the acceleration effect strengthens. Your new contributions are larger. Your base is larger. Your returns are larger. That triple layering compresses timelines dramatically. What once took years begins taking less time, not because you are working twice as hard, but because scale amplifies effort. This is where the concept of inevitability begins to form. Not certainty in any single year, not guaranteed outcomes, but a growing statistical confidence that if behavior remains disciplined, outcomes will likely trend upward over extended periods. That confidence changes how you operate. It removes frantic urgency. It replaces emotional swings with steady commitment. You stop trying to optimize every week. You focus on protecting the system. However, this stage introduces a new responsibility. The larger your capital base, the more disciplined you must be with risk exposure. At $50,000, concentration risk becomes meaningful. A single poorly timed decision can have noticeable impact. This is where many people make mistakes. They feel confident. They experiment with concentrated bets. They increase exposure to speculative ideas because the base feels secure. But security at $50,000 is structural, not invincible. Diversification becomes more than textbook advice. It becomes protection of trajectory. You begin appreciating boring assets. You begin valuing consistency over excitement. You recognize that compounding thrives in stability, not speculation. And perhaps most importantly, you realize that protecting the downside is just as important as pursuing the upside. Because compounding does not require extraordinary gains. It requires uninterrupted time. Another structural shift emerges here. Emergency savings and investment capital become clearly separated in your mind. You understand the difference between liquidity and long-term capital. And that separation prevents emotional decision-making. It allows you to let investments fluctuate without confusing them with immediate needs. When a downturn occurs, you are not forced to sell investments to cover emergencies. Your buffer handles short-term disruptions. Your portfolio remains intact. That separation strengthens resilience. And resilience is the real milestone at $50,000. Not glamour, not display. Resilience. Your tolerance for delayed gratification evolves as well. When you are building from zero, delayed gratification can feel like deprivation. You skip experiences. You avoid purchases. You feel the weight of discipline. At $50,000, delayed gratification begins to feel strategic rather than sacrificial. You are no longer saying no out of scarcity. You are saying no out of alignment. You understand what your money represents. You understand what sustained growth produces over decades. That mindset shift reduces friction. It makes discipline sustainable rather than exhausting. And sustainability is what carries people from 50,000 to 100,000 and beyond. Not intensity, not bursts of motivation. Sustainability. As you move beyond this point, financial thinking shifts from accumulation to alignment. You begin asking what this capital is for. Security, flexibility, optionality. The ability to change careers, the ability to take a sabbatical, the ability to weather uncertainty. Wealth without clarity leads to unnecessary escalation. Bigger expenses, bigger obligations, bigger stress. Wealth with clarity leads to intentional expansion. $50,000 is often the first time clarity becomes necessary, because now the numbers are large enough to influence real-life decisions. And here is a truth that rarely gets emphasized. The journey from 50,000 to 100,000 is often where belief solidifies permanently. If you navigate volatility correctly, if you maintain allocation discipline, if you avoid lifestyle overreach, if you let compounding operate uninterrupted, the results begin reinforcing themselves. You see that the early years were the hardest. You recognize that foundation mattered more than speed. You appreciate that restraint preserved trajectory. And when you look back at the moment you crossed $50,000 invested, you realize something important. That was not the moment you became wealthy. It was the moment you became durable. Durability is what turns effort into inevitability over long time horizons. And durability begins when scale, discipline, and time start cooperating consistently. So what really happens after $50,000 invested is not fireworks. It is not sudden luxury. It is not viral success. It is structural reinforcement. It is emotional steadiness. It is the gradual emergence of control. Control over reaction, control over allocation, control over timeline. And once you gain control, the process becomes less about chasing numbers and more about protecting direction. At $10,000, you felt hope. At $20,000, you felt calm. At $50,000, you feel control. And when control combines with time, wealth stops feeling theoretical. It starts feeling built. That is the shift.